be here, and I just want to start by going back to that film, and the word that came to mind at the end, particularly of the second one, was the word joyous. And of course, having met those young people, there is something joyous about them, and I don't want to idealize them or their circumstances at all, but at the beginning of a day that's going to be about quite difficult stuff, I think it's worth holding in mind that actually, there is hope. Young people do come through this with the right help and the right support, and can indeed lead joyous lives at the end of that. So let's hold on to that as we go through this day. So what I want to do is, I'll keep an eye on my, there's a clock up there, is take you through very quickly the key elements of our inquiry into child sexual exploitation in gangs and groups, and then look specifically at those things that I think are important for you as foster carers, and the extraordinarily important, vital role you play in the lives of children and young people. Can I just ask, how many foster carers are in the room? A few, okay. And others are from what, universities and practitioners? Okay, all right, lovely. Well, I'll nonetheless be thinking specifically about foster carers, I have to say, because that's the focus of the day as far as I understand. Just for those of you who are not familiar with the Office of the Justice Commissioner, can you hear me out there? Okay. Just to let you know that we were established in the Children Act 2004, but I'm happy to say that as from yesterday, the 1st of April, under the Children and Families Act 2014, we have a strengthened responsibility. So our statutory duty now is to promote and protect children's rights. That makes us a human rights compliant institution, compliant with UN principles and standards on human rights, and we are the statutory children's human rights institution then for England. There are other children's commissioners for the other nations. And we are required to have particular regard under the 2014 Act to the UN Convention for the Rights of the Child. So today, and indeed for this inquiry, the articles in the Convention that I'm particularly focusing on are, of course, best interests, Article 3, Article 12, a child's right to express an opinion on any matters that concern them, and most critically, to be listened to and taken seriously. A child's right to be free from all forms of harm and violence, Article 19, and a child's right to be free from all forms of sexual exploitation, which is Article 34. So there are other pertinent articles, but I'm particularly holding those in mind today, and of course those are particularly the articles that drove forward our work on child sexual exploitation in the context of gangs and groups. Just to give you a sense of the evidence base, we gathered over 1,000 pieces of evidence. Over 800 children and young people participated in our 2-year inquiry. We made 25 site visits across England, meeting hundreds of professionals in dozens and dozens of agencies during those site visits. We had 4 oral evidence hearing days as well, to which about 78 different professionals attended. A number of other things in addition. We put out a request for data, and as a consequence of all of that, we produced 6 reports, and I'll just give you a very quick flavour of those reports so you have the context. We focused on child sexual exploitation in gangs and groups, so let me start by giving you a definition before I go into the 6 reports very briefly. What we mean by a gang is this, and it's a definition that comes from 2 sources. One is Professor John Pitts, based here at Bedfordshire, and I'm sure you're familiar with John, and the other is from the Centre for Social Justice, so we kind of combined those 2 definitions. And for us, the definition of a gang is young people, usually male, between the ages of 13 and 25, and usually with criminal intent, which is generally around guns, weapons, knives, and drugs, and with some kind of identifying markers. So that might be name of the gang, clothing, territory, and so on. They don't come together for the purposes of sexual violence. the sexual violence is incidental to what happens. It's as you heard from the young people in those two films, it's kind of what happens when you're growing up in those neighborhoods. And I'll say quite a lot more about that, and I'm sure Colleen will be saying quite a lot more about that when she does her talk later on this morning. What we mean by a group is this. A group is sometimes a looser association. It's anything from indeed a very loose association of people right through to highly organized groups where you may have a pyramid, in fact, with somebody at the top and everything being very well organized, coming together for the purposes of exacting sexual violence against children and young people. There is no age limit in the group definition, and we found young people engaging in group-based sexual violence from the age of about 13, 14, right up to adults. 75, I think, was the oldest account we had, but covering a huge age span. They may never meet. They may come together over the internet. They may use the same places for accessing children for the purposes of sexual exploitation, so they may be using the same sheesh shops or taxi firms or pizza takeaways in order to access children, but there is some kind of connectivity, or indeed it may be over the internet. So, for example, we were shown by one police force some Facebook sites that a group of males had been accessing for the purposes of sexually exploiting children, identifying children, abusing them in real life as well as over the internet. And they were not necessarily meeting up, but they had thousands of children that they were accessing together over the internet. So sometimes it's very real, people who are highly organized, children are being transported by taxis to particular premises where there are these so-called parties taking place. Groups of males are coming to basically rape the children, because that's what we're talking about. Money may or may not be changing hands, but sometimes quite large sums may be changing hands, right through, as I say, to something that's much looser, but there is some degree of connectivity. And I'm afraid to say the only real unifying factor across all perpetrators is that by a large majority they are male. And one of the themes that will ran through the whole of the inquiry is the very significant gender divide that we find in this world of sexual violence, misogyny, and misuse of power, because that is really what we're talking about, which is a long way from saying all men are exacting violence against, we have to hold that in mind. There are some people in every community who are doing terrible things to some children. And for the most part, those some people are male in terms of the perpetrators, and for the most part, as far as we know, the children who are victims are females. So let me take you through very briefly our 6 reports. The first report we did was an additional one to anything we'd planned. It was done at the request of the Secretary of State for Education, on the back of one of the very big trials of group-based sexual exploitation that was taking place, where quite a number of the victims were children who were in residential care establishments, and clearly there were serious failures in their care because they were being sexually exploited, and by that, read rape, while they were in care, very much in inverted commas. And he was very keen to know what needs to be done in order to better safeguard children in our residential establishments. So we may, including answering the question about, should they be locked up in a sense, really? I'll just give you a simple answer to that, because of course they should not be locked up. And indeed we spoke to parents who were parents of children who were victims of sexual exploitation, asked them what they thought about that, and their view was it doesn't work anyway, and certainly not the right thing to do. And if we go back in time and think about pin down and some of the other terrible abuses that happened in our children's homes over the past, if a child, this is clearly not acceptable. If a child needs to be in a secure facility, you have to make a strong business case for that. It's got to be very carefully managed. You have to get a court order and so on and so forth. Our children's homes are not places where children, our community-based children's homes are not places where children can or should be ever locked up. But we made 10 recommendations, 9 of which have now been implemented in full, and the 10th, I'm confident, will indeed be so.
As a result, then we published in 2012 our report into Prevalence. We focused in year 1 on prevalence. Who is doing what to whom and in what kind of circumstances? And without taking you through all of that, because there isn't time this morning, I'll just say to you, in case you're not familiar with it, that we identified large numbers of children for whom we had initials and dates of birth, who were known victims. We, out of that and all the evidence we gathered, identified the signs that children show when they are at high risk of becoming a victim of sexual exploitation, and then the alert signs that they show when they are already victims. And those 2 lists are very, very important. And I'll say something more about them shortly, because particularly for those of you who are caring for children, whether you're frontline workers, or indeed managers, or whether you're foster carers and have children in your home, it is desperately important, and I do use that word advisedly, for you to absolutely familiarize yourselves with those 2 lists, because then you will be able to identify whether the children for whom you are responsible are at risk or indeed are already victims and need the support to which they are quite rightly entitled. We also identified a lot of evidence around perpetrators, and one of the things that emerged was there is also a pattern with boys where they are both sometimes victims and perpetrators. Jenny talked about love and how sometimes people get drawn into something out of a sort of perverted sense of love, really. But if you don't know good love and good attachment, that is incredibly seductive. And again, I'm using that word on purpose. And for youngsters, they can get caught up between being used to exploit girls and draw them in by the older males who are then controlling them. And they get entrapped in that process in the middle. They're both victims and perpetrators, sort of perverted love on both sides, so to speak. And that can be deeply, deeply damaging. But some interesting issues around that. We did find female perpetrators. The usual pattern with female perpetrators is that they have themselves been victims of the gang, not always, but usually, or the group. And they become perpetrators for one of 2 reasons. Either they've become so embedded and over-identified with the people who are abusing them that they then, for that reason, become people who sort of draw children in to the gang for the purpose of abuse, or it's a way of actually ensuring that their own abuse stops. So if they bring somebody else in, there is a promise that their own rape will cease. Though we did find some isolated examples of females who actually orchestrated abuse, including one case where they perpetrated the penetration of a boy with implements. But that was rare. It may be happening on a bigger scale than we identified, but that was rare. The other thing to hold in mind, which is something that Colleen will talk to you about a bit more, is that we knew that our figures were an undercounting. They're not an estimate, they were an actual count. But we knew that they were an undercounting because we, of course, could only count what people were reporting. And one of the things that people are definitely not reporting still is peer-on-peer sexual violence, an extremely serious phenomenon. And if we just go back again to some of the things Jenny was saying, I wrote down the words agency. This issue about children's rights, a right to make a decision and a right to be protected. And when is a decision that's actually not in your own best interests? And particularly for those of you who are caring for children and young people on a day-to-day basis, making those decisions is very important. Easier when there's a big age gap or a big power gap. More difficult when there isn't. And we encountered extremely serious cases of sexual exploitation, rape, by children, peer on peer, when there really was hardly any age gap at all, or indeed sometimes no age gap. And one might think, well, you know, this is a girlfriend-boyfriend thing, and it wasn't. So it's very important to hold on to that issue around agency and power, misuse of power, and don't confuse it with children's rights to make decisions. People talk about, oh, they're just making risky decisions. Actually, as adults, we have a responsibility to protect children. So given what we were finding, which was deeply troubling, we then commissioned some research into the impact on children of viewing adult pornographic materials, not indecent images of children, but adult pornographic materials, because we were finding what young people were doing to each other, particularly the boys to the girls, was really quite breathtakingly astonishing sometimes, and we wanted to understand how this was happening. That was done for us by Middlesex University. They did a rapid evidence assessment of 46,000 different pieces of evidence with a deep dive into about 250, and in short order what they established was, particularly from 15 up, year 9, 100% of boys are viewing adult pornographic materials. Girls at a much lower rate. Of course, children are viewing them from an earlier age than that, but it sort of increases exponentially till they get to 15. A huge gender divide. The boys are looking at the stuff because they choose to, by and large, whereas the girls are looking at it under coercion. They don't want to look at these things, but they're being made to look at them. And the evidence is that there is a correlation between the viewing of these images, including extreme and violent images, and the carrying out of such acts. And there is no doubt at all from the evidence that, again, viewing of these materials affects young people's notions of sex and sexuality and their expectations of themselves and their sexual partners. Issues of dominance, submission, compliance, and so on and so forth. What a body should look like, a boy's body, a girl's body, and so on. What there isn't evidence of is causation, and partly because that is such a difficult thing to do. It's ethically fraught, of course, to do that research. You cannot go around showing children pornographic images, including extreme and violent images, and wait to see what happens to them. But I'll just alert you to the research that came out last Friday from ATVOD, the association that monitors television and video on demand. And what they found was that in December of last year, 44,000 primary school children looked at pornographic images, and 473,000 6 to 17-year-olds viewed pornographic materials, and that's only on PCs and TVs. It's not on handheld technology. So the figure is going to be much higher than that. So if you think about impact, that's very worrying. And then we became very concerned about whether young people even understand the concept of consent. Maddie Coyers here, you're going to hear from her later, at the Child and Women's Abuse Studies Unit at London Metropolitan, in a study led for us by Liz Kelly and Maddie, did very important research for us into children and young people's understanding of consent. I know Maddie will say a little bit more about that, but your primary focus is elsewhere, so I'll just say a thing or two about that. The good news is there were just over 600 young people involved in that research, so it's not statistically significant, but it is a large body of young people. The good news is young people from that study do understand the concept of consent. The bad news is they don't apply it. So again, we have the big gender divide. If a boy has sex with lots of girls, he's a hero and a legend. If a girl has sex with lots of boys, she's a slag and a slut. And even if she didn't want it, if she ended up having sex with him, it is her fault, even when they recognize that it was forced. So if she was in a club and she began dancing with a guy she'd never met before, and he went and bought her a drink, she drank the drink that he had spiked, passed out, she passed out. When she came round in the loos, she realized he'd had sex with her. No consent anywhere at all. Young people's understanding of that is that, yeah, well, she didn't want it, but it is her fault, because she shouldn't have drunk the drink, or she shouldn't have worn a short skirt, or a low top, or whatever it might be. Their understanding of rape is that this is something that happens in a dark alley in the dead of night by somebody you have never met before and will never see again. That's the definition of a stranger. A stranger isn't the guy you just meet in the club for the first time. And rape can't be done by somebody who knows you. So your boyfriend can't rape you, for example. So some very, very important messages there in terms of how we help young people to become resilient, as Jenny was talking about, to avoid risk, to do more than cope in life. We have to actually, that's why I wanted to take you through the research, albeit briefly, because we have to understand these things if actually we're going to protect young people more effectively. And then there was the gangs research led for us by Jenny and John Pitts and their wonderful team here at Bedfordshire University, a 2-year research study for us into what it's like to grow up in a gang-involved neighborhood. All these reports, I have to say, are available on our website. It's a harrowing report to read, and you will have heard from the young people. The words they used just from the film today, were trapped, manipulated, scared. It's a terrifying experience to grow up in a gang-involved neighborhood. One of the young people, when they were showing us the film, let out the 4 films, let out a cry from her absolute core, and she suddenly, whilst talking to us, said, "I'm a human, I'm not an object," because that is how they feel. And what the girls are saying is that when you grow up in a gang-involved neighborhood, the sexual violence and intimidation and power misuse and violence is such that you feel like an object to be used, abused, and discarded at will. One of them said, "Welcome to my generation. It's what happens." And we have to wake up to that. Carleen and I, when visiting a children's prison, didn't visit it for the purposes of speaking to young people about sexual violence and their experiences of sexual exploitation, but one of the young women began to talk to us, in fact several of them, they all began to talk to us that day about their experiences of sexual violence. They hadn't talked to anybody before, so we went back to talk to them in more detail. One of them was gang involved, had a truly terrifying experience, escaped it, I won't go into details, by absolute miracle, but at the end of having been held at gunpoint for about 5 hours and being threatened with rape, she managed to, as I say, by a sort of miracle and sheer circumstance, get out of it. And we said to her, have you told the police? And her response to us was, "Why would I do that?" And I go back to the point about listening, which I want to come to in a second, really. So our final report really looked at why are children still slipping through the net. We published this report last November. Why are children still slipping through the net? What makes for effective practice? Because we spent a lot of time going around the country looking to see what works, what makes a difference, what enables some agencies to protect children and make sure that some children can grow through these terrible and traumatic experiences, do more than cope, and come out the other side, actually to live their lives in the way in which they are indeed entitled so to do. And we developed a new child protection framework called the See Me, Hear Me framework, which we will be piloting, commencing in the next few months, because it was our belief, looking from listening for 2 years and looking at serious case reviews covering child deaths as well as serious injuries and child sexual exploitation, that actually the thing that happened, the most salient feature where agencies fail to protect children, is that they fail to see or hear or attend to the child. The child becomes invisible, unheard, even when the child is literally in front of the face of the professional. So if we just take Peter Connolly, for example, he was visited something like 63 times in his home before he was killed by his parents, and people simply failed to see the bruises on his head. They believed the mother when she said, "Oh, it was just chocolate." If we think about Daniel Pelker, who turned into a bag of bones, to quote one of the teaching assistants at school, a bag of bones before people's eyes, somehow the professional community failed to see that that child was turning into a bag of bones. And the same with these children. Of the many young women with whom we spoke, and some young men during the course of the 2 years of the inquiry, pretty much all of them were in contact with professionals, often on multiple occasions. And people simply failed to see what was happening. They didn't want to know. I think sometimes this stuff is so ugly, so horrible, so violent. It's so much the underbelly of our society. People actually just do not want to face up to it. But we as professionals take on this mantle in order to do that. It is not an excuse. I'll talk to you a bit about the support that you are entitled to and must have if you are to do this work well. But it is a decision we make when we go into this, whether it's as a health visitor or a teacher or a police officer or a social worker or a manager in any of those, or a sexual health worker. It should never be that, as we heard, the 13-year-old girl who went every month to her sexual health clinic saying she was worried sometimes that she was pregnant, sometimes that she had an STI, and nobody asked any questions and referred her on. A 13-year-old girl. She didn't have either of those, and so that was fine somehow. They just accepted her story. "Oh, you've got a boyfriend, that's okay." She was 13. It's not okay. Professional curiosity is something that we absolutely have to have, and we have to couple that with knowledge, experience, awareness, and knowing the research. So, in 5 minutes, I want to just say something to you about, let me just pick up this here, about the risk and warning signs. Jenny referred to these, and especially if you are there as a foster carer looking after young children. I'm talking really in this, but any age child, quite frankly, but in this context, let's just think about those coming up to puberty, because sexual exploitation normally commences as children come up to puberty and then goes beyond that. Very important to hold on to the risk and warning signs and be thinking about them. A child only has to show one of these, of course, not all of them. Might show a series of them, a pattern of them, but I'm not going to go through all of them, but just to alert you, Jenny referred to children, of course, living in very difficult circumstances, being at high risk, dysfunctional households, drug and alcohol abuse. They've come out of homes where there's been, parents have had serious mental health problems, poverty and deprivation, parental criminality. Those things are contributory factors that make children vulnerable. A history of abuse. One of the features of the inquiry was that we found that very often the children who are victims of sexual exploitation had also been victims of intrafamilial child sexual abuse, or sexual abuse linked to the family home. So maybe the mother was a prostitute, her punters were coming to the home, and they were sexually, they were raping the child, basically. We are extremely concerned about the under-recognition of child sexual abuse more generally. And please, if you identify that a child may be at risk of sexual abuse, take that don't doubt what you're thinking. Take it seriously, and talk to social workers and so on. Children who've suffered a recent bereavement or loss. Now, we weren't expecting that one, but that was a high-risk indicator for children who then became victims of sexual exploitation, particularly of a parent or a sibling. And children who are already victims, children who go missing, if you're looking after children who are going missing, it's a very high-risk indicator. They're not being bad, they're not being naughty, they may be frustrating you, they may be difficult to deal with, all those kinds of things, but if they're going missing, you need to be very, very worried. Physical injuries, the sorts of injuries we were finding out about were cuts to the face, especially if they were from gang-involved neighbourhoods, to mark them, or cuts to the thighs, broken fingers, punishment injuries, as well as, I regret to say, sometimes internal injuries. Changes to physical appearance, a very important one, again, that we were not anticipating. We were first told this by a police force who showed us before and after photographs of some girls who were victims of sexual exploitation. Before photographs were of little girls in their school uniforms as you'd expect to see them, fresh-faced, 11, 12 years old, and 8 months down the line, before they put them up, I have to say, in my ignorance at that stage, it was the beginning of the inquiry, I expected to see the after photographs of girls who'd have lots of makeup and, were looking older than their years in that way. But actually what we saw were haggard old women. Photographs of girls who looked like haggard old women. And that was the change that had taken place in the space of 6 to 12 months because of the relentless rape to which they were being subjected. So changes in appearance are very, very important alert and warning signs. Please be alert to them. So, Jenny, I'm conscious of time. I just want to say a couple of things about listening. And the young people spoke about that. Very important just to listen to young people. Article 12, a child has a right to express an opinion on matters that concern them, to be listened to and taken seriously. One of the most important things you can do for a young person in your care or for whom you have some kind of responsibility is simply to listen and be there. What they also need is enduring and ongoing support. These are not easy young people to deal with. Why would they be, given their experiences? And if they're in foster care, they would also probably have had very, very difficult and troubling early life experiences. They're troubled children. They will cause you trouble and everybody else. But they have a right to be supported to come through this. And particularly as foster carers, I would say you have an extraordinarily powerful and wonderful role to play in sometimes just being there, listening, and don't doubt what you hear. Don't think that somehow because somebody else has, they're a doctor or they have another kind of degree or professional status, that your perception about what you are hearing, what you're being told, what you're observing is somehow not valid. Too often we find that the people who are closest to the children, who don't have the high status in terms of being a pediatrician or whatever, doubt their own perception because they feel, well, if a pediatrician is saying X, how can I think otherwise? But you can think otherwise, and don't doubt your thoughts and your observations. You also have a right to support because you are dealing with extraordinarily difficult children given their circumstances, and it is absolutely essential that your agencies provide you with support, proper professional support. Somebody to whom you can turn, somebody who will help you through the difficult times, somebody to be that backstop for you so you can be the backstop for the child, because the long-term goal is to help children and young people come through this. So one of those young people in the film said, "Is this my life going to be over?" And then she talked about her ambivalence and her excitement of being part of the gang and her fear. And our task, of course, is to make sure that for children, their lives are not over as a consequence of this. One of the young people during the course of the inquiry said, if it is the end, it means it's over. And if it's not yet the end, it means it's not yet over. And she didn't mean that in a depressing sense. It was her conviction that it would be over at some stage and all matters would be resolved and she could move on with her life. And that indeed is our task. So on that note, I'll end. Jenny, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.